Hello, ambassadors, and welcome to our new study on How Big is Your God? We're going to take a look at the messages from 4 minor prophets in this month of November. In case you weren't able to be with us in class, or even if you want to continue the study and learn a little bit more, I'm recording this ahead of time so that you can listen to it later if you need to do so. We start with the message of the prophet Nahum. And we talk about how God is slow to anger, but great in power. Let's look at the text from Nahum chapter 1. A prophecy concerning Nineveh, the book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite. The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is filled with wrath. The Lord takes vengeance on his foes and vents his wrath against his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will not leave the guilty unpunished. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes all the rivers run dry. Bashan and Carmel wither, and the blossoms of Lebanon fade. The mountains quake before him, and the hills melt away. The earth trembles at his presence, the world and all who live in it. Who can withstand his indignation? Who can endure his fierce anger? His wrath is poured out like fire. The rocks are shattered before him. The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him. But with an overwhelming flood he will make an end of Nineveh. He will pursue his foes into the realm of darkness. Whatever they plot against the Lord he will bring to an end. Trouble will not come a second time. They will be entangled among thorns and drunk from their wine. They will be consumed like dry stubble. From you, Nineveh, has one come forth who plots evil against the Lord and devises wicked plans. This is what the Lord says. Although they have allies and are numerous, they will be destroyed and pass away. Although I have afflicted you, Judah, I will afflict you no more. Now I will break their yoke from your neck and tear your shackles away. The Lord has given a command concerning you, Nineveh. You will have no descendants to bear your name. I will destroy the images and idols that are in the temples of your gods. I will prepare your grave, for you are vile. Look, there on the mountains, the feet of one who brings good news, who proclaims peace. Celebrate your festivals, Judah, and fulfill your vows. No more will the wicked invade you. They will be completely destroyed. Then turning to the end of the book, Nahum 3 verses 18 and 19. King of Assyria, your shepherds slumber. Your nobles lie down to rest. Your people are scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them. Nothing can heal you. Your wound is fatal. All who hear the news about you clap their hands at your fall. For who has not felt your endless cruelty? I hope you've had a chance to take a look at the questions in the study guide. Here are the thoughts that I had as I was looking at them. Question 1. Nahum 1 verses 1 and 8 tell us that this is a message to Nineveh. Do you recall anything about Nineveh? Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria in Nahum's day, and it was at the center of a vast empire which appeared to be at the height of its power, even though it was going to fall in just a few years. It had a long history. It's mentioned as early as Genesis chapter 10. But it had been one of the many royal Assyrian cities until Sennacherib made it his capital at the end of the 8th century BC, which would be around 700 BC. He spent most of his 25-year reign enlarging and strengthening the old city. He pulled down the former palace and built a vast new one that is only now being excavated. And it hasn't been fully excavated, but even now one can see its large rooms and spacious halls. Sennacherib called it the palace without a rival. He provided the city with new temples and broad streets and public parks. He also built a massive aqueduct that brought water into the town from mountains to the east. The city was circled by a double rampart for the protection of its 300,000 inhabitants. And its armory covered about 40 acres, which is about the size of the property Southwest sits on. Of the cities in the ancient world, the only city that would be larger was Babylon. More than that, Sennacherib was followed by two kings who also enhanced the city, each of them building another grand palace. There was Esarhaddon in the early 7th century and Ashurbanipal in the mid-7th century. Their empire stretched from Egypt through Palestine and Syria into much of Asia Minor and down through Mesopotamia all the way to the Persian Gulf. Nineveh was the focus of the power and wealth. The Assyrian kings used the tribute and booty that poured in from all of the nations that they governed to fortify and enhance their capital. Question 2. Can you think of another prophet who went to Nineveh? What do you recall about his life? Nahum forms a sequel to the book of Jonah, who prophesied over a century earlier. The slide I'm showing you is an artist's depiction of what the city of Nineveh probably looked like at the time of both Jonah and Nahum. But if you remember the story of Jonah, it recounts the way that God remitted his promised judgment toward Nineveh a century before. But Nahum says that long-suffering of God is coming to an end and his judgment is about to be executed. See, Nineveh was proud of her, what she regarded invulnerable city, with walls that reached 100 feet high and a moat that was 150 feet wide and 60 feet deep. But Nahum established the fact that the sovereign God would bring vengeance on those who violated his law. The same God would bring judgment against evil that was also redemptive, bestowing his loving kindness upon the faithful. And you see that throughout Nahum chapter 1 in verse 7 and 12 and 13 and 15, and even in chapter 2, verse 2. The prophecy of Nahum brought comfort to Judah and to everyone who feared the cruel Assyrians. Nahum said that Nineveh would end with an overflowing flood. That's Nahum 1, verse 8. And it happened when the Tigris River overflowed to destroy enough of the walls to let the Babylonians through to destroy the city in 612 BC. From the time the city of Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BC, the site was not even rediscovered until 1842 AD. Question 3, Nahum 1, 3-8. Nahum had a big view of God. What difference does a big view of God make in our day-to-day lives? Notice the text. His way is in the whirlwind and the storm, and clouds are the dust of his feet. Nahum 1, 3. God is prominent and preeminent. He is majestic in his power, magnificent in his person, marvelous in his purposes. How refreshing to step back into the shadows of our own insignificance and give full attention to the greatness of our God. It's all about him. The story is told of a little girl walking beside her mother in the pouring rain and a loud thunderstorm. Every time the lightning flashed, her mother noticed that she turned and smiled. They'd walk a little further, then there was lightning and she'd turn and smile. And the mother finally said, "Sweetheart, what's going on? Why do you always turn and smile after the flash of lightning?" "Well," she said, "since God is taking my picture, I want to be sure and smile for him." We take a major step toward maturity when we finally realize it's not about us and our significance. It's all about God's magnificence, his holiness, his greatness, his glory. And so, Nahum 1 verses 3 and 7, "In whirlwind and storm is his way, and clouds are the dust beneath his feet. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of trouble, and he knows those who take refuge in him." God is transcendent, he's magnificent, he's mighty, he alone is awesome. He's all around us, above us, and within us. Without him, there is no righteousness. Without him, there is no holiness. Without him, there is no promise of forgiveness, no source of absolute truth, no reason to endure, no hope beyond the grave. Nothing compares to him. It's like that grand hymn, "Oh, worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing his wonderful love. Our shield and defender, the Ancient of Days, pavilioned in splendor and girded with praise." Question 4. Nahum 1:2. We read that God is a jealous God. Is jealousy a good thing? When is jealousy good and when is it bad? God alone has the right to be jealous and to carry out vengeance. Jealousy and vengeance may be surprising terms to associate with God. When humans are jealous and take vengeance, they're usually acting in a spirit of selfishness. But it's appropriate for God to insist on our complete allegiance, and it is completely just for him to punish unrepentant evildoers. His jealousy and vengeance are unmixed with selfishness. Their purpose is to remove sin and restore peace to the world. In places like Deuteronomy 4:24, we read things like this: "For the Lord your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God." Or in Deuteronomy 5, verse 9 and 10, "You shall not bow down to them," being idols, "or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments." Question 5. Clouds are the dust of his feet. What is that talking about? Notice the text. The Lord is slow to get angry, but his power is great, and he never lets the guilty go unpunished. He displays his power in the whirlwind and the storm. The billowing clouds are the dust beneath his feet. We just read that his way is in the whirlwind and the storm. Well, the whirlwind and the storm are chosen to represent the suddenness of God's action and the devastating effect of his power. When you read clouds are the dust of his feet, that's not really a reference to what we might think about as a theophany, like when God came to Mount Sinai and enveloped the mountain in a cloud in Exodus 19:16. Oftentimes in the scriptures, clouds are associated with the coming of God to emphasize the heavenly grandeur, but that's not the picture here. The picture here is the picture of God leading an army into battle, and that army is kicking up dust with their boots, and the dust that they kick up is the clouds that you see. When God comes to act, so great is the power of his presence that the clouds are what he stirs up. Question 6, Nahum 1:3. In Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, we read these same words: "He will not leave the guilty unpunished." He goes on to say that God will punish the guilty for generations to come. Does that seem unfair to you? Stop for a moment and take in the full meaning of that warning. He will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. Does that seem unfair to you? I'll admit that it did to me as well until I realized that my view of sin is the problem, not God's justice. We simply don't take sin seriously enough. And when we do, we can be thankful that God in his grace stops at the third and fourth generations. The Hebrew word translated visit means to number, to visit, to be concerned with, to look after, to make a search for, and to punish. His warning is actually an expression of grace, because you see, certain sins tend to run in the family. And so what you've got here is the Lord's promise to track them down and eliminate them in order to keep the sin from propagating from one generation to the next, growing stronger with each one. The human race could wipe itself out if he didn't do something to stop it. Question 7, Nahum 1:7. How can God be a God of both vengeance and goodness? How can God be both good and jealous? The Lord is good, a refuge in times of trouble. He cares for those who trust in him. God's goodness does not mean that he will not bring his foes and even his people's foes to justice. Often we hear people say, God is too good to punish anyone. Actually, the opposite is true. God is too good not to punish sin. God is so holy and so just that he cannot allow unrepentant sin to go unpunished. If God allowed Adolf Hitler to go unpunished for the millions of lives he slaughtered, God would not be just. But he is just, and sin will be punished. Like an overwhelming flood, God's wrath will sweep the wicked away. Nahum 1:6. Try to imagine God without any wrath. What is wrong with this picture? Notice the text, the second part of Nahum 1 verse 6. Who can abide in the fierceness of his anger? The prophecy of Nahum assures us that God is not remote, he's not unconcerned when it comes to world events. Nahum begins by a threefold reminder that God is an avenging God, as he says in Nahum 1:2. But his anger is not like ours. It is righteous anger, it is just anger. So while he is great in power, he's slow to anger. We're often guilty of mistaking God's patience for a lack of justice. We cry out that God is not fair when we see guilty people going unpunished. But the prophet assures the reader the Lord will never leave the guilty unpunished, Nahum 1:3. He goes on to demonstrate God's power over all the earth and its peoples with a simple conclusion. Who can withstand his indignation? Who can endure his burning anger? That's Nahum 1:6. Yet our awesome God is also completely just. He is a good stronghold in the day of distress, Nahum 1:7. He knows those who take refuge in him. But a just God cannot leave the guilty unpunished. So Nahum repeats the word of judgment, declaring that God will completely destroy Nineveh. That's Nahum 1 verse 8. The capital of godless Assyria would be no more. We're sometimes guilty of over-sentimentalizing God, suggesting that he will not bring judgment or cast sinners into hell. We say God is just and he can't overlook sin. Yet he is a refuge for those who know him. Question 9. What eventually happened to Nineveh? Is there a Nineveh today? This is an artist's depiction of the Babylonian overrun of Nineveh. Nahum is writing in about 615 BC, and in that he describes Nineveh as empty and void and waste. That's Nahum 2 verse 10. He says that at a time when Nineveh appears to be at the height of its power, and he's predicting its destruction. And sure enough, within 3 years, it was destroyed and abandoned in 612 BC. The city was so completely ruined by the invaders that 200 years later, about 400 BC, the Athenian historian Xenophon scarcely could recognize the site. And about 70 years after that, around 330 BC, Alexander the Great marched his men right past the location, not knowing that a world empire was buried beneath his feet. Edward Gibbon, the British historian, in the 18th century confirmed that even the ruins of Nineveh had disappeared. And it wasn't until 100 years after that that the British diplomat Austin Henry Layard and the French consul general of Mosul Paul-Émile Botta identified the site in 1842, thus rediscovering the location by the modern world. Imagine that. For centuries, one didn't even know where Nineveh had been exactly. It was so thoroughly destroyed. Question 10. What difference does thinking properly about God make in our day-to-day lives? You see, how we understand the person and character of God the Father affects every aspect of our lives. It affects far more than what we normally call the religious aspects of our lives. If God is the creator of the entire universe, then it must follow that he is also the Lord of the entire universe. There is no part of the world that is outside of his lordship. That means there must be no part of my life that is outside of his lordship. His holy character has something to say about my economics, my politics, my athletics, my romance, everything I'm involved with. How big is your God? I hope this study has been helpful to you. It's the first of our 4 studies of How Big is Your God? Next study, we'll take a look at the book of Habakkuk in a lesson called You'd Never Believe It If I Told You. In the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. See you next time.